Do you have a lot of high private student loan balances that you just can't afford to pay, but you've thought about filing bankruptcy, but were told that you can't discharge student loans in bankruptcy? Did you know that there's a way you might be able to discharge those private student loans in bankruptcy without having to go through that whole undue hardship test that you may have heard about? Well, it all depends on whether that private student loan was a qualified student loan. You see, the bankruptcy code only protects from discharge and requires that test where the private student loan is a qualified private student loan. Well, the next question is, what is a qualified private student loan? Well, the bankruptcy code goes to the Internal Revenue Code, believe it or not, for the definition, and says that a qualified student loan is one that is incurred solely to pay qualified higher education expenses, in other words, the cost of attendance, that is incurred on behalf of the student, his or her spouse, or any dependent at the time the loan was taken out. And third, that it's attributable to education furnished during a period during which the recipient was an eligible student. Now, that's what makes a qualified student loan. Well, how do you determine whether your student loan is qualified? Because if it's unqualified, well, it's a lot easier to discharge in bankruptcy. Well, you can determine that by asking some questions. And the first is, did you borrow more than you needed? That may seem like an odd question, but consider this. Let's say the cost of attendance at your school for that particular year where you took out the private student loan was $50,000. You were able to get maybe federal or state student loans and grants totaling $30,000, but you had a shortfall of $20,000. So you go out and you get a private student loan for $25,000. Well, that puts you over the cost of attendance by $5,000. And that's all it takes to make it an unqualified student loan and seek discharge under the Bankruptcy Code. Now be careful with this though, because a lot of things constitute cost of attendance beyond just tuition. It can include room and board, whether you live on campus or not. You don't have to be living in a dorm. You could be in an off-campus apartment that you rent from a third party. But that rent and the cost of food are considered room and board and therefore cost of attendance for the school. Books and supplies, a new laptop that you purchased for school, and also any cost of transportation to get to and from the school. So the best thing to do is to get a cost of attendance from the school for that year. Ask them. They should be able to tell you. And then compare the amount of money that you borrowed to go to school that year. Now, the next question is, was the school accredited? Well, not always. Check to see whether that school was accredited by the United States Department of Education. Check with the Department of Education and find out. If you discover that they're not accredited or not accredited at the time you took out the loan, that's another basis to have it discharged in bankruptcy. Were you an eligible student? This means that you had the basic requirements to go to college or to go to that school. Did you receive a high school diploma or a GED? Had the pre-qualifications to attend that college? Some schools overlook this in order to get you and get your money. So make sure you're an eligible student. And finally, is a student loan one you co-signed? Were you not the student, but you co-signed for somebody else's student loan? Well, if you co-signed for someone who was not your dependent at the time you took out the loan, then you can discharge the debt. Now, the borrower may not be able to, but you're a co-signer. Someone else is the student, and that person is not your dependent. It was not your dependent at the time you took out the loan. So if you're the aunt, uncle, cousin, best friend of the student, and you ended up co-signing, but they're not your dependent, you should be able to discharge it in bankruptcy. So, again, if you have a private student loan, you just can't afford the payments, and you're looking to see if you can discharge them in bankruptcy, You need to ask these questions and find out if it's a qualified student loan. Now, you file bankruptcy, you still have to bring an adversary proceeding in the bankruptcy court to have a judge declare it dischargeable. You still have to prove that it's an unqualified private student loan. So it is more expensive than your basic bankruptcy. But if you owe a lot of money in private student loans, that can be money well spent in bankruptcy to get them discharged. But if you live in southern New Jersey and you have these private student loans and you're concerned that maybe they are unqualified and you might be able to discharge them in bankruptcy, then feel free to give me a call. I'll be happy to meet with you, go over your loans, and see whether you can discharge them in bankruptcy and move on with your life with a fresh start.